I was born in a very small town called Estancia, New Mexico. I don't live there anymore, but my dad still does. My dad had been hearing things for the last couple of years before this incident happened. He heard footsteps around his house and knocking on his windows late at night. One day, he told me that he wanted to get away from the city and go camping out near Galenas Peak, which is about 45 miles west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, right next to Mount Taylor. My friend Josh, who lives in Rio Rancho, decided to join us for this camping trip, even though we told him what has been happening lately back home. My father and I left our house about mid-afternoon to start heading towards our campsite, where Josh would meet up with us later. We finally arrived at our campsite when it started getting dark outside, so we began setting up camp while listening to coyotes howling all around us. As soon as we got settled into our tent, we were startled by loud screams coming from a pack of coyotes just down the road from us. Josh showed up not too long after the screaming stopped. He said he parked off down a side road because something big crossed right in front of him, so he didn't want whatever it was following him. I wasn't going to tell anyone what my dad has been hearing because I didn't want them thinking I'm crazy or anything, but then my dad brought it up first. When everyone calmed down, my dad broke out his guitar and started playing some music until Josh pointed out that there's no sounds coming from anywhere, like you would normally hear when you're camping. We listened closely, and sure enough, there were no crickets chirping or owls hooting. We sat quietly talking amongst ourselves when suddenly we heard someone walking around near our tents. It sounded like whoever or whatever was barefooted. Well, being Native American, you know your legends such as Skinwalkers, Bigfoot, and others. So I quickly told my dad what he's been hearing lately, and then we all decided to go investigate whatever was walking around us in the dark. My dad handed me his pistol, and Josh grabbed a flashlight as we went out looking for whoever or whatever was out there. I also took a knife with me because of what I'm about to tell you. A few feet from our campsite, we started seeing footprints alongside of mine and Josh's shoe prints. We followed the footprints down towards a creek that ran behind our tents, when all of a sudden, I heard someone crying off in the distance. Josh shined his light up ahead into some trees where we saw something tall standing there. It looked like it had fur covering its entire body, but didn't look anything like Bigfoot. This thing stood there hunched over, almost touching its knees. Its arms hung long past its knees too. At first, I thought it might be an elk, but this thing stood straight up and walked back away from us deeper into the woods, making loud grunting noises. We tried following it for a while until we got lost. Then, later on, during the night, my dad woke everyone up after he said he heard someone running through our campsite. He again handed me his pistol while him and Josh checked things out outside. Sure enough, they found more footprints that weren't ours. The next morning at daybreak, we noticed one tent wasn't zipped up, so my dad went over to zip it closed. Noticing more strange barefooted tracks going right by their tent. They were still asleep, so no one knows how they didn't hear any footsteps coming right by them. As soon as everybody else got up, my dad told everyone about everything that has happened throughout last night. But this was just the main things that happened during our camping trip. I apologize in advance if there's any details that don't quite make sense. I tried to do my best to write everything down to the best of my memory. I should also point out that my dad had a pistol on him the whole time too, so he was never without one. The one he gave me was his spare, a little 9mm with hollow points. I believe that at some point during the night we were stalked by this creature. I can't guarantee that, but I just got the feeling. I feel like it's followed us too since this incident. Anytime we've ever gone back to this area, there is just this weird feeling in the air that's hard to put your finger on. Anyway, I'll stop rambling for now. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to be blunt with you. I believe that I had an encounter with a skinwalker of some kind. If it wasn't a skinwalker, then it was definitely a shapeshifter of some kind. I can't be 100% certain, but I almost am. Anyway, back in 2019, a close friend of mine and I were in New Mexico, and there's this really cool, secluded spot by his father's property that we've always enjoyed camping on. Well, after this, we've never gone back, but we've been to this spot many times before. Anyway, there was one evening while we were out there, and my friends started telling me that not too far away, they're actually used to living with an old witch. And I'm not talking about like an old hag or the kind of thing you would see in European depictions with the cauldron, flying broom, that sort of thing. I'm talking about a real evil mother effer, the kind who sacrifices children and drinks blood. The real deal. Anyway, I guess at some point or another, this witch and my friend's father were actually friends to some extent. I don't know anything about it. I just know that's what he told me. Well, at some point or another, they had a falling out, and she warned him that she would come after him and his family, but this was years ago. And at this time, it was 2019, which means that all of this happened years and years before this. So I just want to say that I don't know if him and I talking about it made these things happen or what. Call it a coincidence. But whatever it was very strange. We stayed in this little two-man tent, and all throughout the night, I could have sworn I kept hearing my name getting called and my father's voice. My father passed away when I was about 12. Suicide, actually. I don't really want to get into it, but I recognized the voice instantly. This went on for several hours, but for whatever reason, my friend didn't even hear any of it. So after a while, I started to suspect it was just me going crazy, and that maybe I was just really creeped out by what he had told me earlier. Well, shortly after this, we started hearing scratching noises outside of our tent. Then came the growling and other strange sounds that I can't begin to explain. Now these are the sounds he and I were both hearing. There would also be points throughout the night where the woods around us would get so quiet that you could just feel the tension. At some point or another, my friend really had to go to the bathroom, but he refused to go outside. So what I would do is slowly unzip the tent for him, and I would shine my flashlight out to ensure that there was nothing out there. Fortunately, we didn't see anything. But when he stepped outside to do his business, which I turned my eyes away so I wouldn't see, we both felt like we were being watched. It was easily one of the worst nights of sleep in my life. I'm sorry that this story isn't all that scary, because we woke up the next morning and got the heck out of Dodge. I can't help but wonder if we really were being watched by that witch or whatever. It was August 2015. And I had been hiking in the Teton mountain range for around 2 weeks. We started at a trailhead called Death Canyon Trailhead. We hiked up through Death Canyon in Grand Teton National Park, crossed over to Fox Creek Pass, which lies on the border of Yellowstone. Then, we went down into Cascade Canyon, which runs alongside Jenny Lake. At that point, we were about 15-20 miles from my car, which was back at Death Canyon. The people who I did this hike with were actually 5 friends. It was August 2015, and I had been hiking in the Teton mountain range for around 2 weeks. We started at the rest couldn't keep up because they packed too much stuff, or something, so they quit halfway through. When you're doing a long-distance backpacking trip like that, you have to be very conservative with your food supply. It's heavy as hell when there are enough cans for each meal, plus extra if you get stuck out there longer than planned due to weather or whatever. Anyway, when our friend group split off from us after coming down from Fox Creek Pass during the night, Hannah and I had no idea how close we were to getting back home. It took us 4 days of steady walking just to reach Morin Bay in Jackson Lake. If anyone doesn't know where that is, think of Yellowstone National Park. except on its eastern side where Montana borders Wyoming. From Moran Bay, our plan was simple. Go north along the Lakeshore Trail until an intersection where she would take a ferry across the bay. Meanwhile, I kept walking along Heron Pond Loop Trail until another intersection where I'd meet her again. We said goodbye right before sunset near some bushes beside Coulter Bay Marina. Once dusk began settling in, though, everything changed drastically. My first thought came as nothing more than an inkling feeling deep inside myself. It was telling me not only what direction things might happen, but also precisely how badly these events could end. At first glance, it seemed as though all wildlife within 50 feet suddenly became aware someone else had entered their territory without making any noise whatsoever. The edge between fear and intuition blurred away entirely, allowing instincts full control. This led me onward towards safety, instead of running straight into unknown danger hidden beyond sight. After taking 10 paces forward, still trying to figure out what might cause such unease felt earlier, we found ourselves directly underneath a tree branch. Above, hanging below, was a large portion of a felled log blocking the path ahead. Caught completely off guard, we now realized why the area felt so silent moments ago. Everything nearby fled instantly upon hearing the loud snapping sound made by stepping under this fallen tree. Every hair on my body stood upright while my breath quickened and my heart rate doubled. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings simultaneously. Grabbing onto small branches sticking out sideways, I managed to pull myself upwards. I avoided contact with the dead wood, finding footing and grip against the bark. I pulled my legs to climb higher toward the trunk, feet finally touching a strong part. I began to walk. I took careful steps, one after another, balancing my weight evenly. My left foot always followed closely behind. My right hand clung as tightly as possible. Warning signs flashed in my mind constantly, reminding me, "You're way too high. The risk of falling is far worse than any injury." Climbing further upward, I eventually reached a spot where I could safely nestle. I was comfortably cradled, both hands tucked beneath my chin. I braced my face protectively against thick, scratchy pine needles. They poked my skin, painful reminders of the dangers lurking everywhere outside comfort zones. Closing my eyes briefly, I hoped I was still dreaming, unaware of the actual reality. Maybe it was even delirium caused by dehydration or exhaustion. I was simply staring, wide-eyed in disbelief and horror at what I witnessed before my own eyes. What I was staring at in front of me was what I can only describe as a deer that was standing upright, but its face was all wrong. It had the face of what appeared to be a wolf or bear, and it had antlers. Its eyes were a striking yellow. It had this aura about it that told me it wasn't friendly or dangerous. Look, I know how ridiculous this sounds, but I'm not exactly sharing this story for clout. I already told you I wanted my name taken out of this story. Within seconds of seeing this thing, it began to mind speak to me, and I felt myself drifting into this strange space between being conscious and falling asleep. It was the strangest sensation I ever felt in my life. I wish I could describe it better. I wish I could remember what it told me, because I don't. I remember that it was speaking to me in a language I don't recall ever hearing. I know that sounds strange, but I've never heard it before, nor can I describe it. Within a few seconds, I lost consciousness, because I awoke several hours later on the trail. Afterwards, I had these strange electrical sensations all over my body. The same ones when you feel you've built up too much static electricity in your body. I'm sorry I spent so much time on the build-up to this, but backstory is always important. There's not a lot more to add because Nothing else weird happened. But I can't help but feel like it was some neutral entity, if I can even call it that. I know I described it as evil, which I felt it was, but I didn't feel its intentions were to harm me. I don't know. The whole thing is very confusing. Maybe you can help me make sense of it. Thanks. I have to preface this by saying that I am Native American, specifically from the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Growing up, my mother would tell me stories about the Booger Man and the Little People. She warned that if you misbehaved, they would come and get you. The sighting happened on a part of our property known as the Old House Site. The house had burned down after an electrical fire. We were clearing out debris from around where the house used to be, so we could plant some apple trees there. It was a very hot day, so we took a break from work. My cousins, my brother, and I walked down through a pine thicket onto what is now our ball field. We continued for another couple of 100 yards or so until we came upon an old hayfield, which is now overgrown with brush. We began to walk across this field towards some large rocks on top of a small rise about 150 feet away. As we approached these rocks, something moving along their base caught my eye. I was expecting one of my other cousins, who we knew was walking through those woods at that time, hoping he would jump out and scare us. However, it quickly became evident that what I saw was not human due to its size. It stood approximately 6 feet tall, but was hunched over much like gorillas do. Its arms hung nearly touching the ground. It moved relatively quickly without breaking stride from left to right behind those rocks, then back again. It stayed just behind them all while watching us intently. When it became clear that whatever it was wasn't going to jump out and scare us, I started yelling. My cousin, who had been walking beside me, yelled, "What's wrong? What are you screaming about?" All the while, he was looking directly into the tree line where the thing still hid, completely except for its head and shoulders. He saw nothing and heard nothing, even though whatever it was stood a mere 20 feet away. It was clearly visible to me, looking straight into its eyes. I also heard the crashing sounds it made as it made its way through the underbrush, keeping at a striking distance the entire time. We encountered it multiple times, though it never once showed anything else besides its head and shoulders the whole time. This went on for several minutes before our parents came to check on why we were yelling and screaming. They found 2 or 3 children terribly frightened, physically shaking, and in tears. We were scared to death, continuing to yell and scream things like, "You don't belong here. Go home. Please leave us alone." When Mom and Dad arrived at the scene, they found no one anywhere near the area. They kept asking repeatedly, "What happened, boys? Tell us what's wrong." After several long moments of calming down enough to talk coherently, we explained everything we had seen, felt, and heard. They didn't believe our story. They said maybe we were imagining things, seeing shadows move, or the wind blowing branches around, causing noises. Others dismissed it outright, telling us to stop making fun of adult situations. It was a serious matter. They were obviously lying, laughing as they cursed and spanked us hard enough to make us cry. We swore to God that everything was true. However, the word spread throughout the community fast, reaching the ears of various people, including teachers, school officials, law enforcement, and even a local news media station reporter. The reporter interviewed us to write an article based upon the claims that children had witnessed something strange in the woods during summer vacation. None of the kids involved ever really thought it was a problem. The biggest trouble it caused was concern with the strict religious beliefs and superstitious fears among the families, especially the older folks and the white ones living nearby. Otherwise, everyone took it in a rather humorous and jesting manner. They jokingly called it names such as Stinky Joe or Bigfoot, using similar nicknames to ridicule the event. It was soon forgotten, becoming a topic of discussion amongst adults. Look, moral of the story is that I believe we encountered some sort of Bigfoot creature that day. I have no other words to explain it, and I think that after reading this, you'll probably come to the same conclusion. I was about 6 or 7 years old when this incident occurred. My sister and I were playing in my bedroom, located at the front of our house, just off of the living room. It was between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock p.m., as it was still daylight out, but getting closer to dusk. My mother, who is a nurse, worked the night shift. She would leave for work around this time every day. Before she left, she called us into her bedroom so we could tell her goodnight. We said goodbye and then returned to my bedroom to play some more. About 10 minutes later, I heard something out by the road near our mailbox, which was only about 20 feet from our front door. I looked up just in time to see an object pass by my window toward where I knew there was an area with flowers planted beneath them. I thought that it must have been a bird because it moved so fast past the window. I continued playing with my sister when suddenly 2 creatures came through my open window, which had no screens on them, without making any sound. These beings were not very tall, about 3½ feet tall. They wore dark jumpsuits that completely covered their bodies except for their heads. They also appeared not human-like. Their skin coloring looked like light brown leather. They both stared down at me. I cannot recall what they looked like other than being small. Then, everything went blank until some time later. That incident has never made sense to me. It wasn't until many years later, when I read about alien abductions involving the Greys, did anything make sense. All these years since this occurred, nothing else ever happened. Something else that I forgot to mention that I thought was particularly strange was the fact that they came in the window. They didn't just climb through like you and I would. They almost kind of glided in a way that defied any sort of physics. It was very strange. My sister was actually with me in the room at the time this happened, but I had this strange memory of her almost being frozen in place. It felt very similar to playing freeze tag when you can't move. Now, and in my young mind, I'm not sure if that's just her being terrified or if they actually did something to her. The more I learn about abductions and UFO contactees, the more I wonder if they did something. What's also strange is the timing, because they showed up right after my mom left. Something else I wanted to mention as well is that when I came, everything was very normal, but a couple hours had passed. It's almost as if it never happened. It was a very bizarre experience, and I never ended up telling my mom about it because I was afraid she would laugh at me or call me a liar. Just before I wrote this down, I actually called my sister to try and recollect what had happened, and she remembers it just like I do. So my conclusion is that whatever these things were extraterrestrial. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In July 1992, I was living with a couple of people who were renting an old house on the north side of town. We lived there for about 3 months. The landlord had told us when he rented it to us that he had been having trouble keeping tenants. They would complain about loud noises at night and stuff like that. One day, my friend John came over so we could just hang out together, since it was our only day off from work. We decided to go down into the basement, which is where I stayed when I first moved in. We took sleeping bags down there so we could watch TV or whatever while talking. As soon as we got settled in, the door upstairs slammed shut really hard. At first, we didn't think anything of it. But then, something started hitting every window on one side of the house all at once. Then, something began pounding against the front door. It made this incredibly loud banging noise, like someone beating on a bass drum with their bare hands, only much louder than any human being should be able to do. And then, suddenly, it stopped, and everything went quiet again. We waited around for a while, thinking whoever was doing this would leave eventually. But after an hour passed by without hearing anything else going on outside, John decided he wanted to get some fresh air before going back inside again. So, just as soon as his feet hit the grassy ground outside, those doors slammed shut behind him. He ran screaming away from them, saying he heard voices whispering things like, "Help me," but he couldn't tell who or what these voices belonged to. Yet, he still insisted they sounded human, even though none of us could see anyone standing near either doorway. For me, the freakiest part about all of this is that this isn't my first rodeo. I actually had a more frightening experience a few years before this. That's why I believe these are connected experiences. Outside my cousin's property, I saw what I believed to be an upright walking coyote. This was an evening time, and it frightened me very much so. I remember it being very weird because the whole thing felt like a dream. Obviously, it wasn't. But I remember being in almost a dreamlike state. I believe they call it an altered state. I felt like my spirit or whatever inside me was very vulnerable and open to seeing and feeling the supernatural. I hope you understand what that means. I'm having a really hard time articulating that thought. Anyway, I came into contact with this being, and I felt it told me that it was my spirit guide, and it was watching over me, and had been. It also told me exactly when my mother would pass, which would be exactly 1 year later to the day. Freaky enough. Exactly 1 year later, my mom passed away after getting horrifically sick. Actually, I believe she had medical complications that had caused her death, but her getting sick was the start of it all. To try and make a long story short, I believe that whatever entity this was had marked me in a way that made me susceptible to the paranormal. And that means that even the situation, like I first told you about, was just another notch in the piece of wood that is my life. Well, as it turns out, years later my uncle would tell me that there were strange entities that surrounded his property that loves to come out during the evening time. He would tell me not to be deceived by them because they were only looking out for themselves and they were the remnants of bad spirits. This was long after my mom and died and after my initial experience with that coyote-looking entity. I also want to make note that I've never taken any drugs. I don't drink, and I'm a very clear-headed, level, and rational person. At least to the best you can be in these kinds of situations. Look, I get it. My experience is very strange, and I have a hard time making out what all this means. But maybe you can make sense of things for me. In fact, if you chose to read this on your YouTube channel, maybe your commenters or anyone who remotely cares could try and tell me if this really was a spirit guide of some kind. Maybe it was really out there to protect me and warn me. I know I haven't spoke about it, but it really bothered me how it accurately predicted and foretold my mother's death. That basically means that I really did deal with a powerful spiritual entity that supersedes time and space as we know it. Not to go too far off on the rails, but I know what I experienced was very real. Any opinions are welcome. Hey guys, just wanted to say that if you guys made it to the end of the video, comment down below Skinwalkers Are Real, so I know who made it to the end of the video and who did not. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Let me know what kinds of topics you'd like me to narrate more of.